Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. Today I'll be showing you how we transformed our old and dated countertops into something brand new, using just paint and epoxy. We used a DIY kit that mimics the look of white marble or granite, but instead of having to spend thousands on new counters, we were able to do this transformation for just $200. This can be used on kitchen or bathroom counters, so if you're looking to make an upgrade to your house but want to stay on a budget, this could be a great option for you. And I'll walk you through all the steps to make sure you have a successful looking finish. Let's get started. My counter was a bit unusual because it was laminate on the top but had these tiles around the edges, and I wanted to fill in all these gaps between the tiles. For that, I used this Bondo all-purpose putty. I thoroughly cleaned all the counter edges as well as the tile backsplash to give the Bondo a clean surface to adhere to. Then I taped off around all the edges. This Bondo is a two-part substance which activates when they're mixed together. You have the majority of the product in the can, but there's also this small tube of cream hardener. Using a putty knife, scoop out some of the Bondo onto some cardboard or other disposable mixing surface. I wouldn't get more than about this much at one time because it does harden really quickly, so you have to work fast. Squeeze out a small length of the hardener onto the Bondo and then mix it extremely thoroughly. You don't need very much hardener, and that small tube is enough for the entire can. Just make sure to mix it until it's all this homogeneous gray-blue color and you don't have any streaks remaining. I then applied the Bondo to all the gaps in between each of the tiles, as well as along the transition between the laminate and tile edge. You want to try to find the right balance between using enough to fill all the gaps, but not using so much that you have a lot of excess. Remember, the Bondo begins to harden in just a few minutes, so don't try to do too big of a section at one time. With this area complete, I used a flexible Bondo spreader to scrape off any of the extra, while leaving the gaps filled in. This is an important step, because any excess Bondo that hardens on the surface will have to be sanded off later. I then moved on to the next section of countertop, repeating all the same steps from before. When you're doing this, it's also important that you wear a good respirator, because when you mix this stuff together, it does give off some toxic fumes. You can see all the excess that I'm scraping off, and it's so much easier to remove now than trying to sand off the hardened Bondo later. Be sure to also wipe off your putty knife after each batch, otherwise the Bondo will harden onto the blade. And the same goes for the flexible scraper. I mixed up another batch, again keeping it small to make sure it remained workable, and moved on to applying it to the tile backsplash. From there, it was just a matter of repeating the process throughout the rest of the kitchen. If you don't have any of this tile on your countertop, you can skip this process entirely, which will save you a lot of time. But here's how it looked once all the Bondo was fully applied and had completely hardened. The next step is sanding, to remove some of these excess Bondo pieces, as well as to make sure the gaps are completely smooth. I used some 150 grit sandpaper, and a great trick is to put some duct tape on the back side. It'll make it a lot more durable so the paper doesn't rip as you're working. The sanding takes a little bit of time, but eventually you should get a nice smooth surface everywhere. This was probably 85% good. To get it perfectly seamless, you'd probably need to do another layer of Bondo and sanding, but I was happy enough with this. All the sanding does create a lot of dust, so make sure you really thoroughly clean off your countertops. If you didn't need to use any Bondo, then this will be step 1 of the process for you. It's still important to clean off your counters so that they're ready for the paint. If there are any areas that you didn't tape off before, make sure they're taped off now. I'll also be painting this edge right next to the oven, and for me it was easier to just move the oven out of the way. I used this kit made by Giani, and it's linked below in the description. The kit includes 1 can of white countertop paint, and then 3 cans each of epoxy resin and epoxy activator. Each of these gets combined when you're ready to use the epoxy. These 2 small cans of paint are used to make the marble veins and highlights, and there's a brush to go along with that. Then you have these 3 rollers. 2 are made of high density foam, which are used for the epoxy, and 1 has some nap, which is for the paint. You also have your misting bottle, some gloves, another couple of paint brushes, some plastic tarp coverings, and a sponge. We're going to start with the white paint, this foam brush, as well as the roller that has some fibers on it. Using the foam brush, you can apply paint to all the edges. It has an angled tip, which makes it great for getting into the crease where the backsplash meets the countertop. Then, using the included paint roller, you can apply the paint to the rest of the countertop in backsplash. Be sure to apply just a thin coat, slightly overlapping each pass as you work along the countertop. We're going to be applying a second coat later, so it doesn't need to be perfect now, and applying too much paint in one coat can cause drips or uneven drying. This is how it looked after the first coat, and you'll notice right away that the coverage is pretty uneven, and there are some spots that are a lot lighter than others. But that's totally fine, let it dry, and we'll come back for a second coat later. In the meantime, I continued around the kitchen, giving everything its first coat of white paint. First using the foam brush along the edges and in the corner, and then using the paint roller for the rest of the surfaces. If you've got a hard to reach space like this windowsill here, make sure you plan ahead and do that first in case you need to step on the counter. I got the first coat finished, and already our kitchen counters were starting to look completely different. You need to wait at least an hour before applying the second coat, so you can store your roller and brush in a Ziploc bag, pressing out the air and sealing it tight to keep everything from drying out. The second coat is applied in just the same way as the first one, but you'll notice how much wider everything is, and you'll get much better even coverage. Once again, make sure you're just applying a thin coat so the paint dries properly and evenly. Here's a great close-up showing how much difference there is between one coat and two coats. I finished up around the rest of the kitchen, double checking that everything had solid coverage and there were no streaks remaining. This is how it looked once I was finished, and I gave it another hour to dry. Now we can work on making the marble veins, using this gray veining paint and thin paintbrush. The kit comes with a little square foam board that you can use to practice your technique. You want to lightly drag and twist your paintbrush along the surface to create the vein's shape. Then you want to spray it with a water mister from a couple inches away until the vein just starts to bleed. Then you can dab it with the larger paintbrush until you start to get a little bit of fading. It's also a good idea to look up some images of white marble so you can see what the veins and patterns normally look like in the natural marble. If you want to add highlights, you can use this white highlight can and the included sponge. Lightly dab it into the paint and then along your gray vein. For more subtle highlights, you can dab off the excess white paint before applying it to your counter. After a few practice attempts, I went ahead and applied this gray veining paint to my actual counter. It's important to have a good idea of the pattern you want before starting. You can have as few or as many veins as you want, it's really your personal preference. But a general rule of thumb is to have 2 to 4 large veins per section and then a few smaller sub-veins. One of the great things is that if you mess up or want to make adjustments, you can actually just wipe off some of this gray paint before it's dried. Once you're happy with how a section looks, you can just move on and repeat the process in the next area of your countertop. Remember, natural marble has all kinds of variations, so this doesn't need to be perfect. But if you do want to make adjustments, just use a wet paper towel and you can edit things just like I did here. If the gray veining paint has already dried, you'll need to go back and paint over it with some of the original white priming paint. Once that's dried, then you can remake your vein. It's just a more involved process, and it's easier to make your changes while the gray paint is still wet. Once I was done with all the veins, I went back and added some highlights by dipping my sponge in this white highlight paint and dabbing off some of the excess. That way there's just a little bit on the sponge and it adds some nice subtle highlights. While that's still drying, you can cover up your cabinets and appliances with the included plastic sheeting. Don't skip this step because some of the epoxy we apply to the surface is going to drip off the edges. It's pretty much inevitable, so make sure you've got everything fully covered just like this. For the epoxy application, we're going to use one of these hard foam rollers as well as the other one of these included brushes. This kit comes with 3 sets of epoxy activator and epoxy resin. We'll combine the two by pouring the activator into the resin, and there's plenty of room in the can for them both to be combined without any spillage. make sure you pour out all the activator and then vigorously stir them both together for a full 3.5 minutes. This is crucial to ensure that the epoxy cures properly. You can then pour out the epoxy into 3 rows on your countertop, starting from the back. Each of these epoxy cans can cover about a 6-foot width of countertop, and you want to pour it all out at once. So if you have a section like this that's not as wide as 6 feet, then you can move on to the next section and pour out the remainder. Using the paintbrush, you can distribute the epoxy along the back edge as well as onto your backsplash. You can also use the brush to cover your side and front countertop edges. We'll use the foam roller for the main countertop surface. You want to use a really light grip, and you're basically just pushing the epoxy around. This stuff is self-leveling, so you just want to make sure that everything's got good coverage and it'll level itself out. Your main goal is to just distribute the epoxy over the entire counter as evenly as possible. Once you've done that, you can combine your next set of activator and resin. After mixing, you can pour it onto the counter, starting from where the epoxy from the last batch ended. I just needed a little bit in order to finish this section, and then I pour the rest onto the following area. It's important to work quickly, especially when you're combining epoxy for multiple pours. You want to minimize the time between your epoxy pours so that it stays workable and it's easier to combine. You have about 40 minutes of working time starting from when you first poured the epoxy. It really is plenty of time though, just make sure you don't have any distractions and you'll be able to get through it no problem. As you're working, you may notice some epoxy dripping down and causing these beads. Every once in a while, just run your paintbrush along the bottom to wipe it off so the epoxy doesn't dry like that. I then mixed and poured out this final set of epoxy. In total, this kit can cover about 35 square feet of countertop when using all 3 cans of epoxy. If you've got more counter space than that, you may need to order 2 kits to ensure you get proper coverage. A little over an hour since I poured the epoxy, I gave the bottoms one last wipe to remove any excess, and then I removed the tape. You want to do this between 1 and 2 hours after you first poured the epoxy, so that it's partially hardened, but not so cured that you can't remove the tape. Be sure to leave the epoxy completely untouched for 2 full days. It's then safe to caulk around the edges if you want to. Just make sure you get the waterproof kind that's made for kitchens or bathrooms. This is an optional step, but I think it makes for a nice transition between the counters and the kitchen walls. If you have a drop-in sink like this that rests on top of the counter, you may want to also caulk around its edges. But with that, this project is done, and you'll be left with some really great looking countertops. I really was so impressed with how well this turned out. It only takes a weekend to do, and for the low price, I'm really happy with these results. The epoxy does take 7 days to fully cure, but you'll end up with this nice glossy surface that's extremely durable. Here's a reminder of what our counters used to look like, and how much this really transformed our kitchen. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more DIY instructionals, then be sure to subscribe so you can catch the next project. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.